All right. So diving back into the basics of Cinema 4D, today we're going to be taking a look at some of the other most important aspects of getting started here. So that's going to be the selection tools, the navigation tools, working with our viewport, some basic object creation, all of that stuff. And it can be hard to kind of separate them and talk about them individually because you need to understand one be able to do the other. So, for instance, how can you navigate a scene if you don't have anything to navigate or orbit around? How can you make a selection if you haven't created any objects? That type of stuff. So, bear with me as we get through this. I promise there is a method to the madness, but let's go ahead and get started. All right. So, here we are in just a new scene of Cinema 4D. And let's talk about navigation first. And what we will do is create an object. So we have something to do here. And I'm just going to create a cube just by clicking on the icon there. We'll create a cube. And so now we have something to see as we go through this. Now, navigation means all the different ways we can interact with our viewport here. And the first thing is that we actually have more than one viewport. If you hit your middle mouse button inside your perspective view, you will then go to the quad view. You can also toggle between that view by clicking on this icon here. Now, it's important to know that while you will spend time in your perspective view, being able to access the top view, the right view, the front view can be very helpful as well for placing objects a little bit more accurately, making sure things are on the ground, all of that good stuff. So I will toggle back to my perspective view by using my middle mouse button. You can also switch views here using F1 through 4. So F1 will be perspective, F2 will be top, F3 right, and F4 front. And that corresponds with what we're seeing here. So perspective is F1, top is F2, right was F3, I think, and then front was F4. So it should go in that kind of order to help you perhaps remember those. But that is a much more efficient way of switching than toggling there. You can also see we have different perspective view options up here. Now, some of these are a bit more than what we need, especially in the configure. But the two that I do want to point out in here are frame geometry and frame selected. Selected is probably the most useful. So H and S for when we want to frame whatever it is we're working on. Cameras is where we can also toggle between our different views, even more than what we just saw, as well as switch between different cameras if we have those inside of here. We also have different display modes, but I'm not going to talk about these today, and some other things as well that we don't really need to worry about. But I just wanted to briefly talk about those just so you understand kind of that we do have more inside of there. Now, when it comes to navigation, there are really two ways to navigate. And I'm really only familiar, well, there's three really. I'm only familiar with one, but I will go over the other two. So let's start with the one I would recommend using. It will require a mouse, and that will be the Alt or Option key needs to be pressed down, and then you can use your three mouse buttons. So Alt and left will orbit, okay, and it will orbit between wherever your mouse is, and if it finds an object there, it's going to try and orbit around that object. Alt and the middle mouse button, all right, so my scroll wheel, I'm pushing in and holding that down, will pan, right? So left mouse button orbit, middle pan, the right mouse button zooms. Now you can also zoom just using your scroll wheel as well, but by doing Alt or Option in the right mouse button, it's a bit more precise, okay? Now the other method that you can use, and I would recommend this method if you were using a Wacom tablet, utilizes the 1, 2, 3 keys and your left mouse button. All right, so 1 in the left mouse button pans, 2 zooms, 3 orbit. Okay, so nothing wrong with using either of those. You can also navigate using the icons up here. I don't recommend those. Those really kind of slow you down in the long run. So use a mouse, use the Alt or Option key with your 3 mouse buttons, or if you don't have a 3-button mouse, or if you're using a Wacom tablet or something like that, use the 1, 2, 3 keys and your left mouse button. The reason why I like the Alt or Option method is because it is more similar to other 3D programs out there. So Maya, 3D Studio Max, I know, all use similar combinations of navigation. Okay, so we've gone through navigation in our perspective view. In our other views, like our top view, our right view, our front view, you can do two out of those three. You can't orbit from these. Okay. Now, backing up just a second, I want to mention that these other views are in a different display mode. So that's why they look different from our perspective to, say, our top, right, and front view. So if you want it to look the same, we are in the, I just call it the shaded mode. Okay. I don't want to try and pronounce that. Um, but yeah, this top shading one is the same as what we have in our perspective view. And sometimes that can help as well. But in, say, a top view, right, or a front, you can pan using the same combination of keys, alt middle mouse button in my case. All right. And you can zoom. Okay. You cannot orbit. In fact, if you try and orbit, you will rotate camera. Okay. Which can be helpful, especially if you're trying to navigate, say, 90 degrees or something. Um, but more often than not, you want to avoid it. Uh, I will say you can hold shift to snap to some more specific increments. I'm not sure what it is exactly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What would that be? 15, perhaps 15-degree increments would be my guess. Okay. So back to this perspective we go. Okay. And so that's navigation. Right. And now what I'm going to do is delete my cube for a second because another big part of navigation is understanding we are working in 3D space. Our perspective view is three-dimensional. We have three different axes. Those are illustrated by the three colors here. So blue is Z, Y is green, red is X. The direction these arrows are facing points to the positive direction. Now, depending on how you navigate, things can get a little bit strange in terms of which direction all these different arrows are facing. So we have this little kind of gizmo orientation thing at the origin, which I'll talk more about here shortly as well. We also have something in the top right-hand corner here that can allow us to see how we are currently orientated. Notice how what we're seeing here matches the little gizmo up there. These colors are consistent for not just position, but rotation and scale as well. You will see them in some of our different selection tools like our move, rotate, and scale, which aren't are kind of selection tools, but also there to do those things as well. So we've talked about 3D space, we've talked about navigation, working with our different views. Let's talk about creating our objects. So we have a lot of different types of objects here that we can create. In fact, these are the most common ones, but not everything. You can find even more in the create section here. And honestly, if you want kind of a good idea of how these are organized, going through the create section here is a really good way to do that. You can see we have splines, we have mesh primitives, we have different operators, and these operators are organized the same way here that we're seeing them here. Okay. And while we don't need to worry about that too much yet, the color will eventually play a role. We have fields, we have virtual set type objects, as well as some other ones as well. Okay. We are going to be primarily focusing on just our mesh primitives for this one. And even then, I'm not going to get too much into these, as I will save a separate video for that and probably eventually get into the modeling tools with them. But if we click on a cube, like we did earlier, we will create a cube. Okay. And I'm going to select it and hit the delete key to delete it. All right. If you left click and hold, you will see your other options. All right. I mentioned previously, anytime you see an icon that has that little tick in the bottom right hand corner there, if you left click and hold, it means it has more options. Okay. So that's what we're seeing. Once again, I can create a cube. And this is our object manager where it'll list all the different objects we have in our scene. You can see the name of the object. You can double click to name it. You have these two icons right here, which are stoplights, which I will talk about later, as well as a checkbox, which you can turn on and off a primitive object. If you select the object, you will see its attributes. Now, I don't want to get too much into these today, but I will mention our coordinates tab here, where we can see specific values for the position, rotation, and scale. And those will be updated when we use our move, rotate, and scale tools. So let's talk about these. I'm currently in my move tool. Okay, the shortcut key for that is E. Extremely important to remember that one. Really, any shortcut key that can stop me from having to take my mouse and move it all the way to the left-hand side here is going to be beneficial. So that's all of my selection tools. My move, rotate, and scale are the most important. ERT. Okay. I also think it is a little bit easier to use the ERT if you are using the Alt mouse button combination to navigate versus the 1, 2, 3. Okay. We have other selection tools, which I will come back to here in a second, but we are currently in our move tool. Okay. Now I have my cube selected by clicking on it in my object manager. You can also select objects by clicking on them in your perspective view. I don't recommend that because as scenes get more complicated, that's not going to be as reliable as working with your object manager here. Now, what we are seeing here is the gizmo for our move tool. And just like I mentioned earlier with the colors and the different axes, we are seeing that in our move tool. So you can hover over one of the handles and it will turn white, letting you know if you were to click and move, that's where it would, the axis it would use. And once again, the arrows point in the positive direction. So if I click and drag and move this up, I will be moving my object up on the Y axis. Now undo that, Controller Command Z. I could do it on the Z axis. All right, already did the X. And notice if I just say move this, a certain amount, it's going to update here. And what these values mean is how far this object has been moved away from the origin, which is 0, 0, 0. Okay. And the point of this object that is actually being moved is called its axis. Think of it like the anchor point. Okay. So that's where it's currently located in the middle of this object, as is the case for all of our mesh primitives here. But as we'll talk about later, it is possible to move this object axis, and that can make things a little bit easier or harder depending on what you're trying to achieve. But what's important is we can move our objects on any of the 3 individual axes here. And if you want more precise control, you can come over to the coordinate tab of that object and type in the values you want there. So if I want 40, if I want 10, if I want 5, I can go ahead and type those in. I did 6, right? We can also use negative values as well. And you can change these sliders by just clicking and dragging on an arrow and just kind of moving back and forth. Once again, if you want to do so individually. Okay. The other parts of these gizmos are these corners, which allow you to move things on 2 axes at a time. So if I want to move something on the X and Y axis, that is what this part of my gizmo is for. Notice how both of those handles turn white. If I want to do on the Y and Z, I can click on that corner part of my gizmo, and down here, same thing. There's nothing wrong with moving things on 2 axes, all right, which we can see right here. That's what's happening as I move this, grab that corner. What we don't want to do is move things on all 3 axes. And that happens if you just click on and drag on the object. Notice how all 3 handles are white. And the problem is it can be very, very hard to position things precisely with this method because when navigating a perspective view, you can really only see 2 dimensions well at any time. All right. And that's assuming you've, set up a good view. So if I'm looking like this, I can get a really good sense of the Y-axis and the Z, maybe not so much the X. If I want to get a good idea of the X, I'm going to rotate more to the side. Really, I'm just kind of fast tracking to my different views here in order to see how things are positioned. What I would do now is kind of pause the video, create some cubes, and take some practice stacking them on top of each other, building some simple shapes like as if you were working with Legos, that type of thing. That's a great way to start to understand navigation, start to understand the move tool. One last thing about the move tool. If you click on it, you will see we do have some other options here. Okay, these are a little bit more advanced, but I do want to point out that if you click on a tool, you will see its properties, its options in the attribute manager here. Okay. So let's move to the rotate tool, shortcut key R. We have another gizmo here. Okay. Now this one still has the same colors. It has these 3 bands that we can use to rotate an object however we want. Just like with our perspective view, or I'm sorry, some of our orthographic views, if we hold shift, we can snap this. Okay. That can make it easier to snap things to say 90 degrees, 45 degrees, or whatever you want, right? I also like to point out that as you switch tools, all right, especially by clicking on them, not using your shortcut keys, you will often lose your object selection down here. So I can switch back, click on my cube again, and now I can see those values in rotation as well. Okay. Now, the one interesting thing about rotation is it's not XYZ. It can be. You can get it to display that way by clicking on this, all right? But you would have to do that for every single object. So instead, and I'm just going to zero out my rotation by putting zeros here. Okay. Heading, pitch, bank. Okay. So keep that in mind. All right. If you're used to kind of planes at all, that makes a little bit more sense. I'm going to create a cone just to kind of, actually, a cone's not a great object to do that. So let's see, what would be a good object to do that? Maybe this figure right here. I'll just move them out here. So heading, right? Come back here. Going to be kind of be what direction we're facing. Pitch, up or down, and bank. Actually, that's not bank. I lied. Bank's going to be this one. Okay, so very much kind of plain nomenclature there. All right, let's get rid of the figure. Select the cube again. And honestly, that's kind of it for the rotation, right? The rotation, its placement relative to the object is a little bit more important than, say, the move or scale, especially when it comes to animation, right? Think of a door, how it pivots from the hinges, whereas this is in the middle. Okay, so we will talk about how to move that, but that is important. If you want to rotate on all three axes, you can just select any part inside the gizmo here. You have a couple of other bands as well that kind of rotate it just kind of based on the screen orientation you have. I wouldn't recommend using those, and instead I would use the three bands we have there. All right, little trick you can do in the coordinate tab, or really any place you have a type-in box here. If you right click on the arrow, it will set it back to its default value. So if you want to just kind of reset an object very quickly, you can right click on any arrow, not just the left one, the right one will work as well. Once again, if you select the rotate tool, we have some additional options. These options become active when we are in our different modes here, the point, edge, and polygon modes. I won't be getting to that in this video, perhaps the next one, but that's why those are kind of grayed out at the moment. Lastly, we have scale. The scale tool gizmo is very much like our move. We have control over the individual axes here. You can pull on these handles, and you may be going, well, wait a second, it's not working. It's not just pulling this object out along the x-axis. And that's because this is a primitive object. There are a few things you can't do when an object is primitive, okay? So really quick, I'm just gonna make this editable, all right, just to demonstrate the move tool. We'll talk more about what that is later. But now you can see as I move this out on the X, it's getting longer. On the X, I can do Y, I can do Z, okay? And all of those things there. Now I wanna point out our scale values actually haven't changed, and they won't change as we make changes here using this particular tool. And it has to do with the way Cinema 4D works. All 3D programs kind of treat scale a little bit differently. There's usually a couple of different modes you can work in. That has to do with our modes up here, which I'll talk more about, but it's not something we really need to be terribly concerned with right now. Okay, right now we are working on the size of our object instead of the scale. It's not something that is kept track of here in our coordinate tab. It's really something that is tracked in our coordinate manager. Now, our coordinate manager is very, very similar to our coordinate tab here. You'll notice that my values are nearly the same, with the exception of here where we can see that it's working with object size, okay, instead of scale. We really don't need to worry about this too much because it is so similar, okay, to our coordinate tab. All right. You can make changes here, but if you don't hit enter, if you don't apply them, well, then it's not going to update in your coordinate tab. Okay. But I wanted to really just show the coordinate manager today for the size thing there. So don't worry about that. But if you want to see how big something is, coordinate manager, and you can look right there since scale isn't always a good indication of that. All right. Finishing up the scale tool, not only can we pull on the individual handles like with our move tool, but you can also do the corners just like your move tool. So that can be a great way to scale on two axes at the same time. If you click on your object, all right, and not on any specific part of your scale tool, you will scale an object uniformly. So it will scale all three axes at the same time, at the exact same amount. This is probably the one time where that's okay. That's, preferred, as oftentimes when we scale something, we're just trying to make it larger or smaller. And so we do want to scale things uniformly so that we don't change their proportions. Okay. So, let's see what else. Let's talk about selections. Okay. So to talk about selections, we need to create some other objects. So I'm going to take my cube, I'm in my move tool now, and I'm going to just move it away from my origin quite a bit. I'm going to create another cube, move it. I'm just trying to create several objects here. Okay. Oops. Perfect. So while you can make selections while in your move, rotate, or scale tools, if you're not careful and you accidentally click and drag on something, you can move it. So while it's possible, we do have other selection tools that are better for this job. Now, regardless of what selection tool we're using here, which we can access all of them by left clicking and holding, you'll see there's a few. You still can use the old shift to add to a selection to select multiple objects, or control to deselect objects. Okay. Now, as I've talked about before, selecting objects in your perspective view, your viewport isn't always the best thing. Sometimes it can't be avoided. I also like to make selections here in our object manager, and that's why it's important to name them. Let's go through our selection tools here. First, we have our brush selection tool, which allows you to just click and drag to select however many objects you want. So very useful. You don't really have to worry about any accidentally moving something. In fact, you see your move gizmo even though you're in the brush tool. I know that's a bit confusing. I wish there was some way to differentiate it, but that is the case here. So you can use your brush tool and move things just like that without having to change. You can change the size of the brush. You click on the brush tool itself. You will see its properties, and its size can be changed right here. Another common option in our selection tools is visible only. I won't get into that quite yet. That's more of a point, edge, or polygon selection thing, but it is important to keep that in mind. So you can adjust the size out here. Notice how that changes the size of my brush. And if you want to see what that does, I'm going to do something quick. I'm going to create a plane. I'm going to increase its segments here. I'm doing this quickly because, I'm not really trying to show all that stuff off quite yet. But when I come in here to say point mode, you can see as I click and drag my brush tool, will make a selection based on its size. The other way to change the size is to click your mouse button in and move it left and right, up and down. Okay. So you can see that can make it easier to change the size if you're trying to select a lot of little things like points. That's all I wanted to show with that. So I will delete the plane. After our brush tool, which is probably the one I use the most, we also have our rectangle selection tool. Okay. And I'll do that. And same type of thing, right? If you've ever used an Adobe application, then this tool should look very familiar, very similar. We can select multiple objects with this. Once again, shift to add to a selection, control to subtract. Right? Once again, see your move tool gizmo there. And honestly, that's about it. Okay. So we can switch to our lasso selection. Lasso selection, once again, if you're familiar with Photoshop at all, this will look familiar, allows you to kind of draw out a selection. And so this can be a great way to um, select things that, in this case, I wanted to avoid one object, or if I want to select things a little bit more randomly, this can be very helpful for creating more complex selections. Okay. Honestly, that's it for lasso. Polygon selection. I mean, similar to lasso, just like the polygonal selection tool in um, Photoshop. So works very similarly. Honestly, I use the lasso tool a bit more than polygon, and I use the brush tool the most. Like I said, uh, you can also select things in your move, rotate, and scale tools. You just have to be a little bit careful with that. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up this video. So I know there was a lot in it. Like I said, in my first video in this kind of introduction series, intro guide, whatever you want to call it, uh, there really is no replacement for spending a lot of time just getting comfortable with all the different aspects of the program. So, with what this video covers, that's going to be navigation, that's going to be selection. And a little bit of object creation, which I'll touch on more in another video. But like I said, create certain objects, just stacking cubes on top of each other, rotating around constantly to make sure they're positioned the way you want. And with that, you'll start to build confidence and speed when it comes to creating, positioning, and navigating, as well as selecting. So that will do it for this video. Let me know if there's anything else you want to see, and take care.